The next stop on our pilgrimage through Normandy is the town of Arromanches, which the Allies miraculously turned into the world's first major port without a harbor. By the end of June 6th, the Allied soldiers had captured their target beaches, but they still had the long, hard road to Berlin ahead. As the fighting moved inland to the hedgerows of Normandy, they would need hundreds of thousands of tons of weapons, ammunition, food, and other supplies. But Normandy had no deep-water port facilities. One reason Allied planners chose this area was because the Germans had thoroughly fortified all the French ports against attack. It was Winston Churchill who decided that if the Allies couldn't capture a port, they would bring a port with them. And you can still visit the result here at Arromanches. This scenic town is nestled in a shallow inlet along Gold Beach. Its many inviting shops and cafes overlook a shoreline that became the scene of one of the greatest engineering feats in military history. Allied engineers in England built two complete portable harbors, codenamed Mulberries, and towed them across the channel to Arromanches.
Well, at the beginning there were two harbors which were built. The one here was for the British, and there was another one for the Americans, which was further to the west. But the American harbor was never used because it was destroyed by a storm only one day after it was finished.
Francois Dubourg works for the Landings Museum in Arromanches, which offers elaborate dioramas and displays that explain how the mulberries worked. Francois, the mulberries were an incredible feat of engineering. What actually went into making them?
Well, the first thing they've done was to form a breakwater, and they used the old ships which came from England under their own steam and which were sunk here on the rocks. And then inside the breakwater they installed the unloading wharves, the unloading piers.
But how could that be done in a water that had a tide?
Because all the elements were floating, they used the hollow platforms, and this way the platforms were floating and they could rise and fall following the movement of the tide, and this way all the elements could be always at the same level. That's the reason why this harbor could be used 24 hours a day.
Now, fully armed and equipped, Allied soldiers began the slow and painful fight for the French farm country known as the hedgerows. German resistance was fierce, and the Allied advance bogged down for weeks. The fishing village of Port-en-Bessin was an early target for the British troops. This working port, which was so vital during the war, is now a wonderful spot for pleasure boating, and the restaurants here have always served an excellent variety of seafood. An elegant old 19th century chateau called La Chenevière sits on the outskirts of Port-en-Bessin. Its central location along the Normandy coast makes it an ideal base of operations for your expedition. In the weeks following D-Day, the battlefront gradually moved eastward, leaving behind the soldiers on both sides for whom the summer of 1944 would be the last. Many of those soldiers were buried here on the French coastline, but far from home. At the German cemetery, more than 21,000 graves are marked by small plaques on a field studded with somber crosses. Perhaps the most peaceful way to end your tour through this battle-scarred countryside is to visit the Normandy American Cemetery. Built on a high bluff, the American Cemetery affords a commanding view of Omaha Beach.
Normandy American Cemetery is a monument to the 9,386 Americans with their final resting places here. In the center of the memorial, you have a bronze feature that represents a spirit of American youth rising out of the waves.
It's beautiful. This trip through the D-Day beaches of Normandy should take about 4 days. Along the way, you might also want to visit Pointe Du Hoc, where 200 U.S. Rangers scaled the cliffs at dawn on June 6th and captured this strategic German gun position. Bayeux, the first city to be liberated during the invasion, has retained much of its old world charm and offers exquisite architecture and the famed Bayeux Tapestry, which depicts another Norman invasion, this one in 1066. Just a bit inland and east of Bayeux is Caen, where D-Day is remembered at the Musée pour la Paix, or the Museum of Peace. The museum also honors those who have furthered the cause of peace in its Nobel Peace Prize gallery. Before June 6, 1944, Adolf Hitler's Nazi juggernaut had seemed unstoppable. From D-Day to the final destruction of the Third Reich, nearly an entire blood-stained year elapsed. And yet, by the end of that first long day, with these shores firmly in Allied hands, the world knew that Hitler's 1,000-year Reich was no longer invincible. The victory here had turned the tide of war. I'm Bill Boggs. Thanks for joining me in Normandy for Historic Traveler.